Hey everyone, welcome to Talks at Google. I'm Matt Bongiovi, and I'm thrilled to be joined today by Rowan Hooper. Rowan is a senior editor at New Scientist magazine and host of the New Scientist weekly podcast. He has a PhD in evolutionary biology, and he has worked across the globe, from a national newspaper in Tokyo to a nanophysics lab at Trinity College Dublin. His work as a writer and journalist has been published in The Guardian, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, Wired, and The Economist. Rowan is here with us today to discuss his recent book, How to Spend $1 Trillion, Saving the World and Solving the Biggest Mysteries in Science. His book poses the intriguing question, what would you do if you had $1 trillion and a year to spend it for the good of the world? There are extraordinary opportunities, but also realistic limitations for what your impact could be in spending this sum. Today, he and I will dig into some of the projects that Rowan outlines. Now, throughout our talk, you might have some great questions popping into your head, and when you do, please go ahead and add them to the YouTube chat on the right. We will have time shortly for Rowan to answer some of these, so be sure to get your questions in early. But first, Rowan, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Before we dig into some of the specific projects that you outline, can you tell us what made you frame a book with this question of how to spend $1 trillion?
It was a dawning realization that there's a huge amount of money sloshing around out there. So $1 trillion is like 1% of world GDP. But even in private hands, there's a lot of money out there. Like the top 1% of the world have $162 trillion. And then I thought of people who win the lottery or win the lotto. They win huge amounts, and sometimes they say, oh, it's not going to change me. I'm not going to do anything different. And I thought, no, use that money for something, And so it came from that, the idea that there's all this money there. Let's just see what we could do with a small amount of it, relatively small amount of it.
Yeah. And you outlined some specifics for the thought experiment, some specific rules. Can you tell us what those are?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of gave myself some rules because I didn't want to kind of turn into a Bond villain and create some crazy secret base. And I didn't want to spend it on military things. And I didn't want to use it for political ends or for media. You could set up something to rival Fox News or something, but quite easily with this money. And that could actually have a huge impact. But I just wanted to make the book manageable and do things I thought were. So the rules are, the money spent has to advance science, it has to improve the lot of humanity, human welfare, or it has to improve the environment some way. So with those three rules, that's how I set about looking for projects to spend the money on.
Yeah. And with those three rules and $1 trillion, there's still such an extraordinary variety of things that you can do.
Right.
And your book outlines kind of 10 specific areas that you focus on. How did you come to that list? Because I imagine that it was thousands of things long when you started.
Yeah, there was a long list, about 25 different ideas that I had. And I started whittling them down. And really, I came to another rule, which was the money had to be spent on projects that were feasible and technically possible now or in the very near future, in the next year. So they couldn't be completely crazy things like, let's build an interstellar spacecraft, because we can't do that. Or, so I had some more fun and more outlandish, even science fiction-y type, really cool ideas on there that scientists are thinking about. But these are things in the more distant future. So that it has to be things that are all doable now. And using that rule, I was able to chop out quite a lot of the more crazy stuff, basically.
Yeah, and it's quite nice because I think as you go through the book, you can kind of see exactly how this money is going to be spent and exactly how approachable a lot of these things are that you describe, which is quite fun. So the first project that I want to dig into that you discuss in the book is your chapter on direct cash transfers.
Right.
Can you tell us what the approach is here and why you chose that as a project?
Well, why I chose it was that I spoke to hundreds of people researching this book about, scientists, basically mostly scientists, saying, look, I've got this huge amount of money. How would you spend it? And only one person, a professor, said, you shouldn't spend this money like this. You should give it to poor people, just give it away. And I hadn't considered that as one of the 10 chapters of my book. And then I started thinking about it and looking into it, and I realized actually you can do some really amazing things just simply by transferring cash lump sums to people. And there's been a lot of work around the world, many different countries, where different charities have given money away to people, and then watched in a sort of controlled experiments, watched what happens, gone back in 6 months, a year's time, and watch what's happened to those people. And the evidence shows that a cash lump sum will elevate people out of extreme poverty in a sustainable way, right? So you can pay them like $1,000 or so, and that's a one-off payment. Come back a year later, 5 years later, and those people have gone up one or two rungs on the sort of poverty ladder. So it can sustainably get people out of extreme poverty. So once you realize that, it becomes, I found that incredibly powerful, and actually it made the rest of the book then really difficult, because you think you could change the lives of millions of people, right now by doing this. And it's funny, I did feel almost like agonizing over how to spend the money. I don't, of course it's a thought experiment,
Right.
But it kind of becomes real. And when you look at all the experiments that have shown what happens when you give money away, it did make it feel very real.
Right. And so in your approach, is it, because obviously there are quite a lot of people around the world, so when you divide 1 trillion by that, there's not that much. So do you take some kind of focus to it then?
Yeah. So I used what the WHO or the World Bank, actually, their definition of extreme poverty is anyone who has $2 or less a day to get by on. And if you exclude everyone else above that, and you take the amount of people in the world who are on $2 a day and divide the money by that, they get about $1,000 each in a lump sum, which is a life-changing amount if you're on a subsistence diet, or living hand to mouth like that, and that's also the amount that's commonly been used in these smaller scale experiments around the world. So you get you could divide up the $1 trillion, and everyone on that level would get about $1,000 each.
Right. And as you mentioned, there have been programs and charities that have done these types of things. And one of the programs that you talk about is a program that the Moroccan Ministry of Education did, where they didn't just give the cash transfers to poor communities, but they kind of did this sort of experiment where they gave some families the funds as being labeled for education.
Right.
But then they gave some families the funds, but they actually had specific compliance requirements that the families had to meet for that funding.
Yeah.
What was the difference in these two turnouts?
Well, it turns out that actually, if you just label it as use this for education, then people will quite happily do that, and they don't have to be sort of ruled and made to spend it with that. If you just sort of guide people, saying, look, spend some of this on putting your kids to school, right. Then they do that. And that's what parents actually want to do, isn't it? Mostly make sure their kids have an education. So, and then that has a whole load more knock-on consequences, because it turns out there are millions of children around the world who don't go to school at all, especially girls. There are, I can't remember how many million it is, girls that simply never get any education. So by giving a modest amount of money a year, you could make sure that all children in the world get an education, and that's another thing that's incredibly powerful.
Yeah, and around this kind of difference between giving the funds with these sort of the overhead of having these requirements versus just having it labeled, does that benefit in terms of, I suppose there's a lot of pushback on programs like these about the cost that it would require to administer the funds and things like that.
That's right. I mean, you have to go back and check that how they've spent it. And if you're doing that for thousands of people, it becomes, a nightmare in an administrative sense. So, actually, it turns out you don't need to do that. As I say, you can just label the money and let people get on with it. And for the most part, people don't waste the money. So this is the thing that sort of finger waggers have often said, oh, we shouldn't give money away to people because they'll just waste it on alcohol or, and for the most part, people don't waste the money, and they use it to build a better house, get themselves some asset that they can then use to sell. So they use it sensibly for the most part, overwhelmingly.
Yeah. And another thing that you talk about in this area is the opportunities in spending the funding to educate girls.
Right.
Can you tell us what the opportunities are there?
Well, so, I mean, for a start, first of all, it's just morally right that girls should get an education, but as a bonus, you might say, I think the difference between girls who have had an education and girls who haven't is 4 to 5 children when they grow up. Right. Like girls who've had an education have on average 4 to 5 fewer children than girls who've not been to school. So family size goes down massively, and with all the associated sort of carbon footprints of those children then go down. So a lot of carbon drawdown projects have been looking at education of women, of girls, as a really powerful method for reducing carbon emissions. So it's something that is not just morally the thing we ought to do, it's actually relatively cheap. And it has this amazing carbon drawdown benefit as well. So, it really ought to be being done, this, because it only costs on the order of billions of dollars. It doesn't, not even hundreds of billions, just tens of billions a year to achieve universal education.
Yeah. And we're talking here now about the carbon drawdown and things like that. Obviously, it would be hard to talk about world-changing projects that we want to fund without thinking about how we would approach climate change.
Right.
Your book looks at various angles on this, and you take it in a few different chapters.
Yeah.
Given the scale of the problem, how did you go about breaking it down into areas that you think could be responsive to this $1 trillion that we have?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, it's a huge problem, and even so, I looked at the transition to a carbon zero economy globally, and it turns out actually I was very lucky that lots of people have already done the work for me on this. So in particular, Mark Jacobson at Stanford, who you might have heard of, he's made this incredible roadmap where he sets out what we need to do globally, across all, not just electricity and power generation, but across all other sectors of civilization, in order to make a transition to become net zero by 2050. So it was fantastic he'd done this. I spoke to him and said, oh, look, here's $1 trillion. Great, yeah. we can get to net zero, right? Yeah. And he was like, dude, this is going to cost $100 trillion in investment. And so I was like, okay. In that case, you need to spend the money in a bit more of a targeted way, in order to get the ball rolling or to move it faster towards where we need to be. So I basically split that project up into 4 different chapters, tackling world agriculture, which is something that people tend not to think about as much as the energy sector, because we all know how much we need new solar power and wind turbine setups to generate electricity, but people don't think so much about agriculture. But it's a gigantic thing. I think world agriculture is the 3rd biggest emitter. No, it's just cows on their own, actually. Just cattle on its own is the 3rd biggest emitter of greenhouse gas, after the US and China. So we've got to tackle this problem. So that was another chapter. So I had to break it up in order to make it even slightly approachable, this problem. Yeah,
that makes sense. And I'd love to hear a bit about one of the specific projects that you discuss. So you have this project around land conservation. Can you tell us what that is and why that's an important thing to look at?
Yeah. Well, so I just mentioned agriculture. because we have so many billions of people to feed, and because their appetites are changing and they all want more carbon intensive diets that are basically cows, cows and other meat products, we're using more and more land in order to raise either soya to feed the cows or to ranch the cows themselves. And so it's eating in massively into very valuable land in terms of ecosystems and biodiversity, especially in the Amazon. So it's really important that we tackle, we protect the land that we have, and we start restoring some that's already been degraded, either cleared for ranching or cleared for crops. So we have to put some money into that. And I mean, you can either simply buy up huge tracts of land and protect them. And you have to include a provision in that and budget for people's jobs. People are farming that at the moment, but we can't just sort of go in and say, get off that land and just go and do something else. You've got to try and build in a way that people can earn a living. And there are ways to do that. People have done that on different levels around the world. Cambodia is a good example. And basically, but I would say roll this out in a much bigger way around the world, protect areas of land, expand areas of land that have protection, help the people that live there, and maintain and restore ecosystems in different parts of the world, around the world. And doing this has the bonus, is a bonus because it tackles the ecosystem, the biodiversity crisis, which is just as bad as the climate crisis, and it draws down carbon, so it tackles the climate crisis as well. So you get two for the price of one there.
Yeah, and you were mentioning that there's this important piece of working with the communities to make sure that there are still jobs and things like that. How does that work? Will it be providing this land to like small scale farmers, or is it something completely different?
I mean, I think it would be a case-by-case thing. In some cases, the local people can do ecotourism. That's happening in Cambodia in some parts. And other places, there can be some sort of farming going on, but just in a more sustainable way. In other places, you might just simply pay people to look after the ecosystem, because then you're paying for the ecosystem services like the clean air and the water, the flood protection that the ecosystem that they provide. So we need to pay in order to get all these benefits out of intact and good, well functioning biodiverse ecosystems.
Yeah. And another project that you discussed that's kind of related to this is this idea of simply going out and spending the money to plant lots and lots of trees wherever we can. Can you talk about that and why that is such a attractive approach?
Yeah, well, it's very controversial, and it's been done in various ways around the world. China have got a huge planting called the Great Green Wall of China that's being planted across a great swathe of China. I mean, it's controversial because you have to plant the trees in a way that's sympathetic to the natural environment, with native trees, not just the trees that are going to grow fastest that then you can cut down and sell for timber. If you're doing this properly, you need to think about planting the right trees, and then not just planting them and going away, but making sure that they're protected, that if they burn down or if something happens to them, that they get replanted, and just protecting them. So it's a long-term project. So I think that people have thought about how much it would cost to plant even 1 trillion trees. And probably they got the sums. It's going to be more expensive than we thought, but you can plant, even with a few $1 billion, you could plant a lot of trees and do a lot of good. And that would draw down a lot of carbon, and it might, again, buy us time to get to net zero by 2050 and try to keep us within 2 degrees of warming. But I mean, apart from it may be that as well as planting trees on a mass scale, you can simply fence off land and stop people building on it, or stop people growing on it, or stop animals grazing on it, and just let the land grow back naturally. That can be a very effective way of restoring an ecosystem and drawing carbon down, and without having all the sort of problems associated with tree planting. So there's several ways about it, but ecosystem restoration by land protection is something I really, I just wish some people would do that on a really big scale, because that could have some amazing impacts globally.
Yeah. And thinking about the trees, do you see this as a project that is basically like a way of getting us to a position where we can address these larger things like the electrification of grids and things? Basically, is it a band-aid to buy time, or is it larger than that?
I mean, it could be, that might be the way you sell it, as if emissions aren't coming down fast enough, which they're not at the moment, and unless something happens very rapidly, we're not bending that curve of getting emissions down. And if it carries on not bending, not going down fast enough, we're going to have to get some carbon out of the atmosphere. And it may be that this mass ecosystem restoration is the quickest way to do that. Maybe the safest way, because there's another chapter I look at is geoengineering and more sort of techno or ambitious projects, ways to get carbon out or to lower the temperature of the planet. But it might be that ecosystem restoration is the safest and most effective way of doing that. I mean, it's not just forestry and not just on land as well. You can do it in the oceans. Lots of ocean ecosystem restoration projects, like restoring kelp and seagrass around coasts around the world, is another really effective way of getting carbon out of the atmosphere and improving the biodiversity of the coastal ecosystem.
Yeah. And you mentioned there that you do cover in your book some slightly more ambitious projects around like geoengineering.
Right.
And one of the things you talk about is this approach of potentially devising some way of shielding some of the sun that's causing the warming that's happening. What's that approach?
Well, there's lots of different ways that people have thought about how to screen out sunlight. And probably the simplest way is just to fly aircraft very high in the stratosphere and sprinkle sulfate particles into the atmosphere, and basically mimic what happens in a volcanic eruption when a volcano goes up and chucks out tons of dust and soot and particles into the atmosphere. If it's a big enough eruption, it has a measurable effect globally on temperature, and we've seen that. So the idea would be to mimic that artificially by putting aircraft up there and chucking sulfur out into the atmosphere. Very, very controversial, because it can have all sorts of knock-on effects on rainfall in other parts of the world. So you might get, floods or famines in other parts of the world. And the other thing, of course, is that once you start doing it, you have to keep going, because if you don't keep renewing this sulfur sunscreen, it drifts down from the atmosphere, and then the sunlight pours through again, and suddenly the temperature whacks back up again. So you have to be also getting emissions down and getting carbon out of the atmosphere at the same time. But I look into some of the different projects. I mean, another way of doing it is to increase cloud cover in different parts of the world and reflect sunlight just by using clouds, by artificially stimulating cloud cover. And that's a way people are looking at, especially in the Arctic, which is warming very fast, as a way of trying to save the Arctic ice, by basically spraying salt water up into the lower atmosphere, creating clouds, and that would reflect sun. So that's another project. None of these things have been tested yet because they're so controversial. But I really do think that tests are going to be needed soon, because we don't want to have to rush into this thing when I mean, look, we've seen in the last few weeks some horrendous effects of extreme weather around the world. You can imagine a few more of those. They could easily get worse in the next few years, that people might start saying, oh my God, this stuff is real now. We've got to rapidly do something about it. So we need to know what's going to be our best option. So that's why I recommend spending some money on that.
Yeah. And one of the things that you mentioned at the top about the rules in this thought experiment was not spending it for political things or for lobbying. But then you do have a bit of a discussion around implementing a carbon tax as a solution to decarbonizing the world. Can you tell us what role you see for these types of regulatory approaches, and specifically carbon taxes?
Yeah. Well, so I don't go into this too much because it's not a book on economics. I wanted to make a more of a fun book about spending and what you could do.
Yes.
But I felt I have to mention it because the economists that I did speak to said that they see a carbon tax as ultimately the best way of getting emissions down, because you're basically playing in the system. If people can make money and save money by not emitting as much carbon, then they're going to do it. Simple as that. And so if you build that carbon tax into the system, then it's going to kind of automatically, through the laws of capitalism, make people start finding ways to get carbon out of the atmosphere and to stop emitting as much. So, I mean, it might be interesting another, if someone else had written this book, you could look at what you could do to kind of put your thumb on the scales. Imagine you took this $1 trillion and bought carbon credits with them, and then started playing the market. You could force a market for carbon, and that might be a way to bring a carbon tax into effect in a global financial sense. So I mention it because I think it probably is, or almost certainly will be eventually, a thing that we all have as a way of really getting serious about getting emissions down.
Yeah. And so do you see it as kind of a precursor or a requirement to getting some of these other projects that you discussed to be palatable by large communities? Or do you kind of think that we can still go for funding these other projects and people will buy into those without needing that sort of forcing function?
Well, one thing that really surprised me, actually, as I was working on each project, was how I realized that the money, this $1 trillion that I was spending in many different ways, often pays for itself by savings that you make in the next few years. So I guess with climate change, with the transition to renewable energy, most people are aware that if we spend now, we're going to have to spend less on doing the damage of climate change later. We've already left it too late, but even if we start spending a lot of money now, it's going to be better to do it now than pay more later. But it's the same with medicine. It's the same with alleviating poverty. If you spend money on poor people, you don't have to spend money on them when they get ill later. So actually, in many of the chapters of the book, the money they spent, it feels like this fantastic amount of money, but it pays for itself. In some cases it generates money later. So I think that sort of way of communicating it would be a way to get people's buy-in to these projects.
Right. That makes sense.
I hope so.
Right. Yeah. So moving away a little bit from climate change, you also have a chapter on settling off planet. Can you tell us why that came to be in your list of 10?
Well, I've just watched the Jeff Bezos rocket launch, actually, before chatting to you. So this is very fresh in my head at the moment because, I mean, that was in my list really as more of one of the sci-fi ones that it would be cool to do before I started really thinking of what seriously important world-saving things you could do, some of the more fun things you could do. And that are like all of them that are already being done. So there's already a lot of money going into space exploration at the moment and construction of reusable spacecraft. SpaceX is massively leading the way, but there's lots of other things coming up behind it. And Jeff Bezos, his stated aim is to get heavy industry off of Earth onto the moon, so that we can so he says that we can save the planet, save this one, and stop mining stuff on Earth and mine it on the moon instead. So even though it started off as I like space travel, kids like space travel, let's throw some money into it. It's actually, you could do serious things with it as well. So that's why it makes the cut, because you can not just advance science, but you can eventually do things that do alleviate pressure from Earth and help the Earth environment.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you touched on it a bit there, but you outlined that your approach would most likely involve a settlement on the moon as opposed to targeting Mars, which
Right.
I suppose is a bit of a hot take. So do you have why do you decide to go for the moon instead of for Mars?
Well, so I did actually want to go to Mars first, just because it's a cool. No one's been to Mars yet.
Yeah,
It has its own atmosphere, only a small one, so it's better in some ways than the moon. But then I spoke to lots of planetary scientists and even astronauts as well, and they basically all convinced me that you've got to go to the moon first. The other thing, of course, is you could make a settlement on the moon, including science bases, tunnels, like farms,
yeah,
robots, science facilities, all of that for well under $1 trillion. Whereas to do anything approaching that on Mars, it's going to be much more expensive. So it was also a practical thing. The moon is cheaper to do it on. It's closer. We've been there before. We already have, or will nearly have, rockets that are able to get there. SpaceX have nearly got theirs ready. So it'd be relatively easy to piggyback or to augment the projects that are already happening, and really push for a more sustainable moon base.
yeah. And one of the things that's that's going on in a discussion today with space is thinking about how to do it in an equitable way. Especially the current sort of headline grabbing approaches are billionaires going into space. Have you thought about that in the book as well? Can you tell us about that?
I mean, that's very much part of it. Is that in this sort of utopian dream that I have $1 trillion to spend, I would then, the reason to spend some of this on space exploration is not just for the science, but so that it's not just the purview of billionaires and the US and China, basically, who are leading the way. It's looking like at the moment China are already, they already have a rover on the far side of the moon. They already have a lunar program that they're pursuing. NASA have one, and then of course Bezos and Musk have their own programs. But I don't want it ideally to be just those entities dominating what happens on the moon. This is just such a huge part of humanity's future that in my ideal world, we would spread out the benefits and the opportunities to other countries. So I propose making an umbrella organization that I call the Terran Alliance. Give all space agencies, or lots of space agencies around the world, give them a few tens of billions of dollars each. That would allow them to then become major players in a truly international moon base that you could set up. And I think, and that's the other thing. You could give $20 billion to, say, the African Space Agency, and that would allow them to become a major player in what's happening on the moon. So just exactly as you say, to make it equitable, that's what it's about, and to spread the opportunity around some other nations.
Yeah. And do you see these space-going projects as being able to kind of bring in a lot of resources to a community, bringing scientists and bringing lots of different industries to someplace that doesn't necessarily have it currently?
I mean, I think, like we've seen in the space program before in the past, like it has loads of spin-off benefits for other industries. But if you were serious about going to the moon, there's a lot that needs to be done, from robots going up there to prepare it, to growing stuff on the moon for us to eat, farming on the moon. And then the eventual plan of Bezos would be to generate power there, solar power, and beam it back down to Earth in microwaves, but also to mine, to do mining on the moon and construction on the moon, so that heavy industry gets off of the planet. Of course, then you'd wreck the moon, but which some people are very upset about. But you have to think, well, if we can't really rein in what we're doing on Earth, maybe it's better that we wreck the moon.
Right.
You know.
Yeah. And you also discussed one of the cooler things I thought was putting computing infrastructure on the moon.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, well, this was something that blew my mind. The amount, if you look at the amount of computing power that we're currently using, and you might have seen, you know, as well for Bitcoin mining, the amount of coal power being used to mine Bitcoin. You know, we're going up and up and up with the amount of computer power that we're using. So one idea is you put all or most computing infrastructure on the moon. It uses solar power up there to do all the processing, and then beams down. So if you need something, basically it would go up to the moon and down again. Right. So the moon becomes like a very unromantic image, but the moon becomes like a giant server farm for Earth. But again, it might, if that took some of the ecological pressure off of Earth, then, you know, it might be worth doing. And if we are, you know, the way that the pressure and the demand for computing and processing power is going, we're going to have to do something.
Yeah, definitely. So the opportunities that you look for, I suppose, in this book are potentially changing with COVID and with people's susceptibility to these sorts of large-scale projects. What kind of things do you think will change in the next few years post-COVID?
Yeah, it's hard to see, you know, that when about a year ago, when we were really still at the kind of beginning of COVID, a lot of people were saying this is a great opportunity for us in a climate change sense, because we have now the opportunity. We're all locked down. We're not flying anywhere. You know, emissions have gone down. We have the opportunity now to keep hold of this, and people have become used to you know, mass restrictions, changing their entire lives. You know, and people have done it on the whole. So, you know, the idea was, well, that's great because we need to do something similar to tackle the climate crisis. So maybe this is a way of kind of keeping going on this. But emissions of going back up really you know, massively rebounded. So I'm a bit less hopeful about the, you know, the COVID effect being helpful for tackling the climate problem. But what it has shown us is that we can change. You know, working habits have changed. Doing things like this, we're all used to having meetings on Zoom. You know, so many things like that. I feel that there is still an opportunity that we could grasp as a result of COVID.
Yeah. And do you think people's appetites for these types of large-scale funding projects has changed at all?
I'd like to think so. You know, let's see what happens in the US, because President Biden is just trying to get, you know, he's got one $2 trillion bill through. He's trying to get the green infrastructure bill through. It depends how much he's you know, how many concessions he's going to have to make. But you know, his ambition was around $6 trillion he wanted to pass in various stimulus and, you know, reconstruction bills just this year. So I hope there's appetite for it. Like I say, the incredible thing about this is that spending this vast amount of money pays for itself. You know, it's really worth doing it now. Obviously, you have to borrow it and pay it back later, but it's really money well spent. So I really do hope that people would buy into that.
Yeah. So we have some good audience questions coming in. So we'll jump to one. We have one from William who asks, I'm curious of the locations of the $1,000 studies. This is going back, I think, to the cash payments. Was it in locations where $1,000 was a significant amount, or did the $1,000 make a big difference in developed countries such as the US?
So it's been done all over the world, actually. I've got lots of different examples in the book. Mostly they've been, most of the studies have been in countries where there are very poor populations. So, you know, in like Ethiopia or was it Peru, Chile, you know, in communities that are very poor, where $1,000 is a life-changing sum. But actually, there's been some really interesting studies done in Alaska and various states in the US as well. So you may know that Alaska has an oil huge oil revenue, and the state pays dividends to its citizens, and each citizen gets a cash handout each year. And people have looked at what happens with that money. Does it make people, because one criticism is if you give people money, they'll just stop working and, become unemployed. But that's not the case. So in answer to the question is most of them have been done in poor countries, but there are studies in the US as well.
Yeah. So our next question is from Sumit, who asks, earlier you mentioned Green Wall of China. What are some other interesting, super expensive, but wide impact sustainability projects being implemented right now in other parts of the world?
Well, there aren't any super expensive ones that are being implicated at the moment. That's kind of my mission, is I wish people would do them. I mean, there are loads of projects being done on a smaller scale in terms of ecosystem restoration. But because no one's got or no one's putting this huge amounts or even slightly large amounts of money into these things, they're necessarily having to just do them in little bits. But they're all really promising. I mentioned kelp farming and seagrass restoration. There's been some really nice stuff showing what you could do doing marine ecosystem restoration in different parts of the world, as well as grasslands, peatlands, as well as forests, different forests, so tropical as well as temperate forests. But, there aren't any super expensive ones because no one's got the money.
Right. So our next question is from Alonzo, who asks, I wish I had $1 trillion. Do you feel optimistic about humanity successfully tackling the problems it faces?
I mean, yeah, mostly I feel optimistic. Yeah. We are good at solving problems. And I have to be optimistic because that's the only way out of this, by tackling the problems. Sometimes it's frustrating to see the slow pace of inaction. And this is why, actually, this is another thing that got me to write the book, was you look at how slow science progresses. It's not really because the questions are so hard, although it is in some cases. It's often because scientists have to eke out research over decades for lack of money. And by chucking money, relatively small amounts at problems, you could go a long way. So it was a case of thinking, look, all these, millions and billions of dollars are spent on, you might say frivolous or, consumer items, property, but let's spend them on some things that could really make a difference.
Yeah. And that was one of the interesting things that I was thinking about, is to what degree are some of these research problems, especially in some of the harder science projects that you look at, to what degree are they no longer responsive to additional funding? Like, do they have a point at which where there's just not enough scientists studying it, so you can't be responsive to funding, or does it continue to just grow the more you can fund it?
I mean, some of the really deepest questions that scientists are trying to answer are not ones that you could we could suddenly answer if you put $1 trillion on someone's table, because they're going to need the construction of, say, for physics, particle colliders that are way bigger than the ones we have at the LHC in Switzerland, and that would take decades to plan and construct. It would cost a huge amount. You might have to do it off planet, and then it's going to cost more. And these are really long-term questions. So yeah. But many practical parts of practical questions in science and medicine, especially, could be really, really moved ahead rapidly with relatively small amounts of money.
Yeah. And as we start to wrap up, I wanted to look at one last chapter that you talk about, which is particularly relevant today, the chapter on curing all diseases.
Yeah.
And you specifically write about how universal healthcare is such an important and foundational piece of this. Can you tell us about that and why that is?
Well, I mean, as you say, it's foundational. Like, it's no good. So the Silicon Valley approach at the moment is to try to tackle death
Right.
You hear people in Silicon Valley say, death is a disease and we can cure it. And lots of money is being put into projects to try and prolong life, increase lifespan. And there's some really cool stuff. But if you're thinking globally, how to increase global health, the only thing to do is to have a universal healthcare system. And if you could do that, it would lift lifespan globally. It wouldn't cure all disease, but it would just improve human health in a huge way. And so, that chapter is called "Cure All Disease," and I took that from the Zuckerberg-Chan initiative, and their stated aim is to cure all disease by the end of the century. And I think that's a bit ambitious. That won't happen. But with universal healthcare, you could do a huge amount of improving global health. So that's why that's in so much emphasized in that chapter.
Yeah. And so we have time for one last question. So we have one. Karen asks, how did Rowan evaluate the positive impact of where he spent his $1 trillion? In other words, what were the weighted variables that factored into the equation of where to spend best?
Yeah, I mean, basically, the good thing about writing the book was it was my $1 trillion. I could spend it where I liked. So in some sense, I didn't have to go to committees and say, oh, how should we spend this? I could say, let's spend it here. And, that might well not be the right way to spend it. But I would just talk to people and say, what would be a sensible use of this money in this area, and take advice. And then I can make my own mind up. And that was the fun part of it, that I could just have fun with it. But to a certain extent, I did try to evaluate what would be the best use of it, especially when it comes to things like healthcare, like you just mentioned, or slowing down climate change, for example.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and so we're just about out of time. Rowan, I want to thank you again so much for being here. This has been an absolute pleasure talking with you today.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, great questions and great to chat.
Yeah, so Rowan's book, How to Spend $1 Trillion, is available now wherever books are sold, including through your local or independent bookseller. It's seriously very insightful and a ton of fun, so I seriously recommend it.
Thanks, Matt.
For everyone who joined us today, we look forward to seeing you at our next Talks at Google event. Please stay safe and take care.